Hi, my name is Cara Dudley, and this is my Ukraine case analysis for the Spring 2025 Causes of International War course at East Carolina University. Today, we will be discussing the historical context of the current war in Ukraine and presenting an analysis of stigmatization against Russia prior to and during the war. We will also be applying theories from several levels of analysis to the case of Russian stigmatization and the invasion of Ukraine more broadly. Before we look at the case analysis and apply relevant theories, I first want to review the background context to the current conflict in Ukraine. Firstly, Russia and Ukraine share a very deep cultural, economic, and political history that began prior to the 18th century. Their histories are closely tied to each other, exemplified by the fact that Kiev is often referred to as the mother of Russian cities, given its significance in the roots of Christianity within what became the Slavic nations. When the Soviet Union came to be, Ukraine was considered to be the second most powerful state within the Union, given its contributions to the agricultural and defense sectors. Later, when the Soviet Union fell in 1991, Ukraine established itself as an independent sovereign nation and began to align itself more with the democratic European and Western nations, distancing itself from its Russian history and breaking from its Slavic roots. This has created geopolitical and social challenges for Ukraine, as its close cultural and historical ties to Russia see some of the populace, namely those in the eastern regions, aligning themselves with Russian ideology and culture. With this context in mind, the justification for Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea was to protect the ethnic Russian population living in the region from a supposed Ukrainian genocide. Putin used the same justification when he launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, in combination with Russia's justification that the eastward expansion of Ukraine, to include possible Ukrainian membership, posed a grave threat to Russia's national security. It has been more than 3 years since Russia invaded Ukraine, and now Russia occupies 20% of Ukrainian territory. It's estimated that there have been 40,000 civilian casualties since the invasion began, and that 10.8 million Ukrainians have been displaced as a result of the war. As of today, there is no clear path to negotiation or outcome for a clear winner in the conflict, despite recent attempts by the U.S. to broker peace. Starting off with our case analysis, we'll be analyzing a journal article written by Adrian Rogstad titled When Stigmatization Fails, Russia and Aggression in Ukraine. This was published in the Journal of Global Security Studies in 2022. Within this article, Adrian argues that the international community failed at its attempts to stigmatize Russian aggression during the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the full-scale invasion of Russia in 2022. In order to comprehend the author's analysis, we first need to understand what stigmatization is and the theory behind how it can change a state's behavior. The definition of stigmatization utilized by the author is the process by which certain physical or social attributes and behaviors, and the actors displaying such attributes or behaviors, become marked as abnormal or deviant and relegated to an inferior position in society, thus reinforcing social norms. Essentially, it is a strategy used by a nation or group of nations to change another state's behavior and reinforce the norms in which the implementing nations desire. As outlined in this article, there are four interrelated components or tactics utilized by nations to undertake stigmatization. Those are labeling, stereotyping, separation, and status loss. In using these tactics, the goal is to achieve social control and cohesion through the enforcement of normative standards, through the creation of consequences for those nations who are socially deviant. And I'll make a note here that given the diversity of thought, government style, leadership, and other extenuating circumstances within the international community, states disagree on social norms. In this case, we are evaluating the attempt by mainly Western democratic nations to reinforce the social norms in which they desire. As mentioned by the author, it's also important to understand that stigmatization is not just naming and shaming, but rather it is an integration of tangible consequences to social deviation. Moving now to the stigmatization in the case of Russian aggression, the author mainly analyzes the implementation of stigmatization during the illegal annexation of Crimea. However, she also discusses how the tactics were utilized during the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The first aspect of stigmatization that was utilized during the annexation of Crimea and full-scale invasion was labeling. Here, nations publicly stated that Russian behavior was an unjust aggression and a violation of Ukrainian sovereignty. Nations furthermore stereotyped Russian behavior as being outdated, stuck in the past, and as being on the quote, wrong side of history. Nations undertook separation by canceling their engagements with Russia and disinviting them to international forums such as the G8 and withdrew their support for Russian membership in organizations such as the International Energy Agency. The goal here was to create a notable us versus them separation, with the us group being represented by mostly Western nations who categorize themselves as law-abiding nations who were on the quote right side of history and had abandoned acts of aggression and annexation long in the past. Versus the them group, in this case Russia, who they were trying to categorize as falling outside of the international norms and as deviators from the new social norms of the international community. The last aspect of stigmatization applied to the Crimea annexation, as well as the full-scale invasion, was status loss. To undertake this, nations came together to impose various sanctions against against Russia. This included sanctions focused on certain sectors of the Russian economy and prominent individuals believed to be directly related to the violations against Ukraine. This included things such as travel bans and the seizing of assets against those individuals and limiting Russian access to markets such as those in the EU, as well as preventing the cooperation with companies critical to Russian infrastructure and defense. With the implementation of these sanctions, it was emphasized by the EU and other organizations that the goal of the sanctions was not to strictly serve as punishment, but rather were designed to bring a change in policy and activity. Within the article, the author provides an analysis of why the stigmatization attempts against Russia failed to achieve the desired results despite the utilization of all elements of stigmatization. Not only was there a lack of change in Russian behavior during the annexation of Ukraine, or Crimea, but it actually became significantly worse as Russia escalated to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The first aspect of the failure outlined by the author is Russia's utilization of counter-stigmatization. Throughout both conflicts, Russia denied the accusations of aggression and instead placed accusations of aggression on Ukraine and Western nations. Political cartoon depictions, like the one on the left, highlight Russian tactics to utilize information warfare and information overload within public media to characterize Western nations as the true aggressors. Russia highlighted previous military action from Western nations, such as the invasion of Iraq, as proof that the West was the true aggressor within the international community. There was also a lack of international consensus when it came to the stigmatization of Russian aggression. During the 2014 annexation of Crimea, the UN passed a resolution declaring a commitment to the territorial integrity of Ukraine. However, as the voting record indicates, only about half of UN members voted in favor of the resolution, with the majority of the nations in support of the resolution being from European and North American nations. The author argues that this was not a strong enough audience to properly stigmatize Russia, as almost half of UN member nations, to include those most closely aligned with Russia, failed to stigmatize Russian behavior. The author also cites the wavering of Western commitment to stigmatization as a reason for the failure. She cites the election of President Trump and his administration's departure from stigmatization as significant, given the loss of commitment from what is largely considered to be the most powerful Western nation. Additionally, she cites the eventual political and economic softening from other Western nations over time as a reason for the failure. There was also a pattern among the nations attempting to stigmatize Russia in which they allowed material interests to take precedence over the moral implications that they were trying to place on Russia. This includes examples such as Germany continuing to undertake significant oil purchases from Russia until even after the 2022 invasion, as well as many nations negotiating with Russia for access to COVID-19 vaccinations. Examples such as these led to inconsistent sanctions against Russia and the fear that the cost for Western nations was too much to bear to justify pursuing more aggressive sanctions against Russia. In part because of the hesitation from Western nations to bear too great of a cost in stigmatizing Russia, the author argues that the economic consequences that were placed on Russia were not impactful enough and were able to be circumvented by Russia. Rogstad highlights Rogstad highlights how despite the significant reduction in direct foreign investment, it was not significant enough to bring about significant behavioral change. Additionally, it was found that Russia was able to replace the trade and direct foreign investment they lost from the West with an economic pivot to Asia. Lastly, the hope of Western nations that the status loss and material consequences of the stigmatization campaign would force a reversal of Russian aggression towards Ukraine as the Russian population expressed discontent was squandered. This was as Russia was able to keep stigmatization at bay, as is evident by the trend of Putin's increasing approval rating as seen on the left. The case analysis undertaken by Rogstad to understand the failure of stigmatization against Russia provides an opportunity to evaluate the findings against theories across several levels of analysis that seek to explain the causes of war. The first two theories, deterrence theory and compellence, are closely related. As described in Chapter 9 of Cashman's book, deterrence theory is the maintenance of a credible threat of retaliation against an opponent so that the opponent refrains from launching an attack. This causes the anticipated costs of starting a war to outweigh the expected utility of war. Many theorists highlight that deterrence theory can be applied not only prior to a conflict, but during one as well to prevent further escalation. This is where our comparison to Rogstad's article comes in. While deterrence theory is typically applied to military power, in the case of Russia, we can see how stigmatization, especially through financial means intended to change policy decision making, could be seen as an attempt at deterrence despite its failure to change behavior. In line with the traditional association of deterrence with military power, perhaps a more appropriate categorization of the stigmatization behaviors analyzed within the article is that of integrated deterrence. Integrated deterrence is a relatively new theory of deterrence that calls for the utilization of all tools of national power combined with those of allies and partners to deter aggression. In utilizing economic and military means alongside military ones, the threat of deterrence becomes not only a military disincentive, but also one that has far-reaching consequences for the society as a whole. Closely related to the idea of deterrence is that of compellence, which is the use of threats to persuade a nation to change their behaviors or stop an action. As Cashman mentions, Compellence is much harder to achieve than deterrence, as deterrence doesn't require a behavior change. The goal is to maintain the status quo of an adversary, not attacking. One comparison to be made here between stigmatization, deterrence, and compellence is the utilization of some form of power to influence the decision-making of another nation. The failure of stigmatization against Russia provides a meaningful case study for scholars looking to better understand the relatively new concept of integrated deterrence. The next theory we will discuss in the context of Russian stigmatization is the bureaucratic politics model. This theory is based on the concept that government isn't a single uniformed decision-making body, but rather a group of actors and organizations who constantly compete with each other to influence decision-making. This requires political actors to negotiate and compromise as they struggle with each other to exert influence over policies. In the context of Russian stigmatization, we can apply this theory to two different groups: the stigmatizers and the stigmatizee. The struggle to gain and maintain international support for stigmatization was likely due to the internal struggles within nations to commit to such a drastic policy goal that had severe domestic economic consequences. The bureaucratic politics model highlights how the political jockeying leads to middle-of-the-road policies that ultimately prioritize domestic interests over international ones as politicians vie to influence policy and hold on to power domestically. We can theorize that this was the case during the implementation of stigmatization against Russia, as politicians in Western nations competed with each other to either take a full-on approach to Russia or prioritize domestic wellness and earn domestic approval. We could also apply the bureaucratic politics model to the strategy used by Western nations in their targeting of specific Russian actors, with the goal to impose costs on them for supporting Russian aggression. In targeting these specific individuals, Western nations recognized their importance to the decision-making process within Russia and were attempting to compel them to change their behavior and thus influence them to reverse their advocacy for Russian aggression within the bureaucratic system. Within the realist theory of international affairs is the central idea of security dilemmas. Security dilemmas are often created by a state's self-reliance in providing for its own security. In an anarchical international system, there is no central government body that monitors aggression and enforces peace amongst the states. Therefore, all nations are left to their own devices when it comes to their defense. Within this dog-eat-dog world, when an adversary or neighboring nation increases their defenses, it inherently makes other nations less secure as the balances of military might shift. Within Rogsted's article, there was a failure to analyze how security dilemmas may have had an impact on the failure of stigmatization. While Russia was undoubtedly considered to be militarily stronger than Ukraine in the lead-up to the 2022 invasion, the recent eastward expansion of NATO and advocacy for Ukraine to join the defense alliance created a new security dilemma for Russia. While the economic and norm enforcement behaviors of stigmatization were significant, they weren't significant enough to create a behavior change. This is especially when you consider the prospect of what NATO expansion means for Russian security. It is likely that Russian calculations for the addition of Ukraine to NATO, as well as recent eastward expansions of NATO, had made their threshold for war significantly less and their willingness to bear an increase of economic sanctions significantly greater. So, while Western stigmatization attempts were significant, they were not aggressive enough to change Russian behavior within a heightened state in the new security dilemma that they were facing. The last theory we will be reviewing for this case analysis is the polyheuristic theory of decision-making. This theory conceptualized political decision-making within the typical environment in which policymakers have incomplete information, are facing time constraints, and have an ultimate desire for re-election and domestic political approval. This theory can help us explain why many nations were unwilling to take an all-in approach to stigmatizing Russia. This theory hypothesizes that decision-making is undertaken in two stages. In stage one, all policy options that are deemed unacceptable are eliminated. These are usually the policy options that are deemed to be too risky to their domestic political re-election or approval. And then in the second stage, the remaining policy options are weighed so as to minimize risk and maximize benefits. While this theory provides an explanation of a logical decision-making process that takes into account the calculated manner in which politicians carefully navigate public approval, this decision-making process has an impact on how committed to a cause nations are, such as in the case of stigmatization. As is typical within the polyheuristic theory of decision-making, the policies in the case of Russian stigmatization ultimately ended up taking more of a middle-of-the-road approach as domestic concerns dominated political decision-making. This caused policymakers to satisfy their domestic political base rather than implement a solution to Russian aggression. Based on the discussions within Rogstad's article, we can apply this form of decision-making to the possible reasons why some nations failed to commit to stigmatization and why some, mostly Western nations, eventually reduced their commitment to stigmatization. This is as it's likely that during the political decision-making process, most nations realized that they were not willing to sacrifice their domestic approval ratings to take a drastic, more aggressive approach to stigmatizing Russia, and why some nations failed to stigmatize Russia at all. They saw no personal domestic political gain in doing so. And this is the last slide of my presentation, which contains the sources used for my research for this presentation.